Hi everybody. Today I'm taking a look at Axis and Allies Guadalcanal from 2007. Why this one now? Recently I noticed my local game store had a copy of the Renegade reprint for what I thought was a fair price, so I decided to pick up a copy. For many years, for me, A&A Guadalcanal fell into the same category as Avalon Hill's Queen's Gambit, the Star Wars game with lots of plastic, meaning at the time I wanted it, but it was so expensive. And the few stores where I saw it jacked up the price to a point where I just couldn't justify spending that kind of money. For example, Queen's Gambit, I think in 2000 it was around $100. And that's the highest amount of money asking price that I'd seen ever for any game up until that point. And Guadalcanal in '07, around where I lived, was in that neighborhood as well. It wasn't cheap either, and it came and went before you knew it. Furthermore, many early reviews of it that I read were not overly positive, and I bought in a D-Day just a few years earlier, which I wasn't overly impressed with. So at the time I thought if Guadalcanal was the same quality, pass. Fast forward almost 20 years later, and luckily we get a reprint from a different company at a more sensible price, so I'm in. So what follows, I hope, will be a bit different from what other reviewers have offered on the subject. I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. First, I want to share some of my first impressions of the modern reprint. Then I'd like to ask some questions I have about particular design choices and how they might affect gameplay. And then I will propose and test some strategies in hopes that someday in the future I might make a more informed mods video or something along those lines. What I'm trying to say is I really need playthroughs, both solo and opposed, so I can answer some of the questions that I have. Here, I decide to document a solo session to get a baseline feel for the game. And note that when I have a physical board, I prefer to use a turn summary format as opposed to live play. For me, the Vassal engine is more conducive to live action. Even then, I do my best to edit out boring parts because I like to keep the action moving along. Anyway, my first impressions are overwhelmingly positive, and that's an understatement. Great production value all around. The pieces look great. I love the Japanese transports, the cardboard tokens, the map. There's no clutter issues. So I'm impressed. The rulebook is excellent. Everything is clearly explained. The only thing I don't care for, like everyone else, are those dice boxes with the drawer thing, and I'm going to pour my dice out of a cardboard tube onto a print and play hit chart. So that's an easy workaround for me. So after reading the rules and setup, I came up with the following questions I'd like to eventually answer. I want to see how the game solos. I suspect that it's not going to be great to play solitaire due to the pulsing nature of the turn structure, but I think I'll still be able to enjoy it. This is probably one you'll really want to play opposed. I want to see the new combat system in operation. Certainly appreciate the effort that went into coming up with something new whereby the players don't have as much control over delegating hits and losses. But will it ultimately be worth the trouble? Will the game run as smoothly as traditional Axis and Allies? I also have a few early concerns. Well, actually not concerns, more like questions about some curious rules and a few other rather odd design choices. And I gotta believe other critics mention these issues too. But for me, they are as follows. I don't understand why the Japanese don't have a battleship advantage leading into Guadalcanal. They only started losing them during the course of the battle. So that seems weird to me. Land-based artillery impacting surrounding sea zones in the Pacific Ocean. That to me suggests that in early playtesting, artillery seemed too weak and somebody was just reaching for a solution. Any aircraft guns getting 3 dice kind of seems OP to me on the surface. Aircraft carriers get no dice against airplanes? Really? Those things were bristling with AA guns. The combat footage shows it. They could fill the sky around them with flak. Anyway, I'm going to assume these few odd rules facilitate greater playability somehow and set a balance that would otherwise not be there. Literally everything else about the game seems spot on. Supply rules, airstrips, the transportation of supplies, scoring system. It all really blows my mind. Like, I don't understand how people come up with all this stuff. It's excellent, and I could never do it. Really like how the configuration of the C zone sets up like a really difficult balance, operational problem for either side. All that is just so cool. Anyway, I'll head back to the table and begin the session report. Okay, so we're back at the table. I'll take care of a few points of order here before we start. I gave Guadalcanal 1 out of 4 trigger value. Sure, there are people out there who would criticize any version of Axis and Allies for the trivialization of warfare, the glorification of conflict. The game doesn't convey any sense of tragedy or cost in human lives, so just be advised you might want to skip this game if that type of thing bothers you. Anyway, I decided to randomly draw optional rules tokens for each side, one to each. So Japan got a command decision prerogative, and the United States drew the indigenous coast watchers. But there's 2 tokens that come with that power. I'm going to use some paper money. Might as well, I have it, but it's not necessary. I'm also going to use some plastic vector arrows so I can illustrate movement more effectively. And you will notice I also like to add a bit of ambiance, some sound effects, some stock footage at times to keep us in the mood. And so Japan has the initiative on turn 1. The Japanese want to move everything up from Rabaul and form up the IJN somewhere north of Choiseul. They need at least 1 transport to sail back to Rabaul to pick up a supply token and an artillery. Might even sail 2 back to Rabaul to prepare to move off the AA gun and to be determined first round build. The immediate goal is to construct a second airstrip on Bougainville as early as possible. Guadalcanal is a write-off, as is Malaita. Japanese aren't interested in contesting those islands for now. Santa Isabel and New Georgia are different stories. Even though the Japanese are going to pull some supplies out of New Georgia, they plan on returning. At least that's what they're going to tell their modern men left behind. No real aggressive moves from Japan on the first turn. I don't think it's necessary. It's probably better for them to consolidate their forces into a powerful task force so they can strike on turn 2. It might seem a bit passive, but rest assured, beginning on the second turn, they're just going to go straight after the Americans. That's the plan anyway. Round 1 for the USA is straightforward. America wants to move up and clear out Guadalcanal and capture Malaita on the first turn before Japan is ready to react. And this will leave the USA with 2 distinct task forces, one in either sea zone south of Guadalcanal. At the start of turn 2, they will decide what's next, Santa Isabel or New Georgia. And so we'll come back with turn 1 combat and its aftermath. On the first turn, there was no air attack phase or sea attack phase. First thing that happened, however, was the destruction of the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Second, the capture of Malaita by the USA. The Marines took 1 casualty, securing Guadalcanal. They took no losses, securing Malaita. Japanese engineers construct a second airstrip on Bougainville, and the USA builds a second airstrip on Guadalcanal. So the CBs are hard at work. Japan gets 26 reinforcement points, USA gets 18. Here I display turn losses against turn builds. Japan deploys a 3rd aircraft carrier, a submarine, 2 supply tokens, 2 bombers, and an infantry, while the USA builds a battleship, 2 supplies, and 2 infantry. Score after turn 1 is 2-2. USA has the initiative going into the second turn. They already know what they're going to do. Their entire fleet is going to form up south of Santa Isabel. So let's see how the Japanese respond on the second turn. The initiative passes to the United States at the start of turn 2. The US moves supplies into Malaita. We will have a new airstrip there next turn. The US Navy sails into the slot south of Santa Isabel. They're going to dedicate a substantial amount of resources to the invasion of this smaller northern island group. This move, however, is meant to be a diversion of sorts. Hope is that this operation will provoke a response from Japan away from the larger objective to the south, New Georgia. USA wants the fight over Santa Isabel to pin the Japanese down while they prepare a stronger move on the very next turn against the bigger, more valuable island chain. The U.S. will interpose their fleet between the two amphibious missions. This will give them the ability to respond immediately if either of the landings runs into trouble. The USA might redouble the Santa Isabel effort only if the initial engagement goes well. Otherwise, the main focus will remain New Georgia. The IJN responds aggressively according to plan, just as the Americans predicted. The Japanese supply Choiseul. A new airstrip will be ready there next turn. Japan decides to fight tooth and nail over Santa Isabel. They are not prepared to give up their garrison. In fact, they will land new forces at the opposite end of the island where the Americans are invading. They come close to matching America's overall effort in the immediate region. They, like the Americans, are, however, holding back a lot of power in reserve, both naval and air. Japan isn't just thinking defensively. When the initiative passes back to them on turn 3, their fleet will be on the move again. After Santa Isabel, they plan on bombing and or raiding Malaita. They aim to knock out that brand new American airfield, even while supporting the greater battle for Santa Isabel. The combat results for turn 2 were as follows. The air battle over Santa Isabel was a draw. Both sides lost a fighter. No surprise there. Land battle was a different story. The US Marines slaughtered the Japanese garrison. Japan just couldn't roll hits. Japan lost 6 infantry and 2 artillery in the futile attempt to defend the island, while the US only lost 2 infantry and a single artillery. Santa Isabel falls to the Americans. Over 2 turns, the Japanese have already lost triple the amount of ground forces. The running total for the game is 12 units lost against 4 combined artillery and infantry units lost for the US. This unexpected development will no doubt alter Japan's plans going into the third turn. Anyway, Japan builds an airstrip on Choiseul. America does likewise on Malaita. Japan builds 1 aircraft carrier, 1 submarine, 1 fighter, 1 artillery, and 6 infantry. The US builds 2 aircraft carriers, 6 infantry, and 2 artillery. The income for either side now is equal. Neither side spent money on supplies. They were more worried about a massive naval clash next turn and the prospect of having to replace large combat losses. The score after turn 2 is still tied, 5-5. Japan will have the initiative next turn. They need some kind of reversal of fortune. They are prepared to take aggressive actions that will result in a decisive confrontation with the US Navy. Anything else at this point would result in the fall of New Georgia, and that's not an acceptable outcome as long as the IJN is an effective fighting force. This is the start of turn 3. Japan has the initiative. So far they've tried caution as well as a measured response to US aggression, neither of which has worked thus far. Guadalcanal and Santa Isabel have fallen, so now it's time for maximum effort to save New Georgia. The IJN cancels the hit-and-run plan for Malaita. Instead, everything they can muster both in the air and on the sea will head into the slot to face down the US Pacific Fleet. Only 4 transports will be left behind as they are on their way back to Rabaul to pick up supplies. Japan will have a slight advantage in ships. The US will be superior in the air. It's a risky move, but a necessary one. At some point, Japan must make a stand. Otherwise, the American threat will only continue to grow stronger. As far as the US is concerned, New Georgia is the next target. If they have to go through the IJN to capture it, so be it. They have been winning battles up until now. They have no reason to alter their plan based on Japanese maneuvers. Like Japan, the US commits everything that can reach. Both navies have been itching for a fight. Sea Zone G will be the site where the two sides finally clash. If there's anything left after the naval engagement, we might even see fighting on the island itself. Before I move on to the combat resolution part of the video, I just wanted to illustrate the size of the battle in Sea Zone G. I had to use fleet markers from ANA Pacific just because, unfortunately, the smallest sea zone printed on the map is usually probably going to be the site of the largest battle, and it's not large enough to hold all of the action. So just look at the scale of the combat you have to resolve sometimes. In this version of history, a massive showdown took place over land, sea, and air between the Empire of Japan and the United States of America. The site of this pivotal clash was in and around the small island of New Georgia, within the larger Solomon Island chain. Here is what happened. First, Japan launched a surprise attack with 3 submarines. All missed. The US responded with 2 submarines of their own. More misses. And Japan was so disappointed with that outcome, they even cashed in their command prerogative token to replay the combat phase. Japan re-rolled triple sixes. The US in turn scored a torpedo hit on a Japanese battleship with their own submarine warfare. So this was a truly horrible start for Japan. Next came the air battle. Japan shot down 3 American bombers and 2 fighters. Unfortunately, they took an equal amount of casualties. Japan lost 3 fighters and 2 bombers. So it was another draw in the skies. The outcome of the naval component to the battle, however, did broadcast a clear winner. When the smoke cleared, both Japan and the United States realized they had each lost 1 carrier, 1 battleship, and 1 loaded transport. Unfortunately for America, there were additional casualties beyond the shared losses. The US Navy also lost 1 cruiser and 2 submarines. Furthermore, another US carrier and another cruiser suffered damage and so were withdrawn from the operation. So this was a clear victory on water for the IJN. The Empire of Japan desperately needed this decisive reversal of fortune. Now, the battle on New Georgia was a much more costly victory for the Japanese. They kept control of the island but lost twice as many ground units as did the Americans, 4 infantry against 2. So it was another bloodbath. They lost so many infantry, in fact, only the presence of friendly cruisers in the adjacent sea zone allowed Japan to technically claim control over the island. So, what was the overall result of the first battle for New Georgia? It's a clear Japanese victory. The US Navy must now turn back, regroup, and lick its wounds. And yet, all this comes with a serious dilemma for Japan. They now have an opportunity to pursue and perhaps rout the retreating Americans, but if they do, they need to take their cruisers with them. And by doing so, this will hand over control of New Georgia to the United States. So, it's going to be a really difficult decision to make. Anyway, America builds 4 transports with a 4 supply premium, 1 apiece, to place them already loaded directly onto the board south of the western tip of Guadalcanal. They have to buy 2 more supplies to repair damaged ships, and with leftover loose change, they buy another supply token. Japan is going to do something similar, but with 3 transports. In addition, they have to replace some infantry losses. They buy 6 more divisions of infantry and also spend their last bit of money on a new fighter. The score is now 10-10. Each side gets 2 bonus points for sinking capital ships. The initiative will pass back to the United States for the start of turn 4. And I'll break up the action here for an intermission. I will conclude the game in a part 2 video. I really don't know what's going to happen. The events of turn 3 have now thrown the final outcome into question. But I do know I'm having a lot of fun playing this out solitaire, so stay tuned for the conclusion of the story. Thanks for watching.